Hello, good morning. So we're going to continue on our topic about cellular reproduction. We're going to talk about meiosis and mitosis. So before a cell can divide, the genetic material condenses into these chromosomes. The genetic material is being copied and condensed into these chromosomes in that first part, or that first big stage. So after crossing over, the chromosomes separate and the cell divides into two new cells. Each new cell now contains half a number of chromosomes, then divides again, making a total of 4 daughter cells. Each chromosome splits into two rod-like structures called chromatids. Each chromatid contains a double helix of DNA. Note that each of the 4 daughter cells has one distinct chromatid. So remember, each daughter cell in meiosis is going to have just that one chromatid that is going to have half of the genetic material that is inside one of our body cells. So for humans, it's going to have that 23 chromosomes in each of the daughter cells that meiosis creates, whether it is a sperm or an egg cell. Okay, so the two main types of cell divisions are called mitosis and meiosis. The majority of our body cells divide to make two genetically identical new cells in a process called mitosis. The cell's nucleus divides into two new nuclei and identical copies of the parent cell's genetic material are distributed into each daughter cell. Mitosis produces two identical daughter cells with the same DNA as the parent cell. The sex cells produced by meiosis, however, are not genetically identical. There are two reasons for this difference. First, crossing over exchanges genetic material between homologous chromosomes. Secondly, the two cell divisions that occur in meiosis produce 4 daughter cells, and each cell has half of its parent's DNA. As a result, each sex cell has a different genetic information. That's very important. That is why we have all our children looking that look very different from each other. We also have humans that look very different from each other. No one's exactly the same because of this process that occurs in meiosis called crossing over. So this is the next standard that we are going to be focusing on. Like I've said before, if you have a trouble with it, I would definitely recommend going on CPOMs, typing it in, and you would get a very good lesson with it. So for this one, you're comparing and contrasting a general process of sexual reproduction requiring meiosis and asexual reproduction requiring mitosis. Now, living things reproduce. So giraffes make more giraffes, hermit crabs make more hermit crabs, and bald eagles make more bald eagles. So some animals produce offspring that look exactly like the parent. Others, such as humans and the animals out in the wild, produce offspring that look different from the parents. Animals use one of the two main methods, asexual or sexual reproduction, to produce offspring. Reproduction guarantees that a species' genes are passed on to the next generation. A reproductive process that involves only one parent and produces offspring that are genetically identical to the parents is called asexual reproduction. It is the simplest form of reproduction. Animals such as sponges, corals, and certain jellyfish reproduce asexually. One form of asexual reproduction is fragmentation. During fragmentation, a new organism forms from a piece of the original. For example, a whole new sea star can develop from a single arm that breaks off. Another method of asexual reproduction is called budding. In this process, the new animal grows out from the parent until it fully matures and breaks off. Sponges and sea anemones reproduce in this way. So like I just said, so fragmentation is just a piece of it falls off and then it creates a brand new organism, just like a sea star. And then budding just is just like this. Yes, the child will break off, but it makes sure that it's matured first. So it does not grow on its own. This little piece does not grow on its own if it's off of the parent. So budding just makes sure that the offspring is attached to the parent until it is mature, then it breaks off and it creates this new organism. Remember that these organisms are exactly the same as the parent because it does go through asexual reproduction, which means that they are only going to be getting the same amount of chromosomes as the parent, and it is not mixed with any other genetic material. Now, in comparison, we do have sexual reproduction that has many pros and cons. So some of the biggest pros in sexual reproduction is that they guarantee this genetic variation. So they are going to be increasing the survival method. So over time, they're going to evolve into species that are going to be able to adapt better to the environment that is constantly changing on our world. So our genetic variation is very important. Now, our con will be finding a mate in remote areas. So, for example, polar bears are not going to be able to find a mate very quickly when all the ice keeps melting. So, over time, they might start being less of polar bears because of this sexual reproduction that does need to take effect into making more and more. Now, for example, if we have a sea anemone or something like that, and for some reason many of them are dying, they can always reproduce because they only need themselves. They don't need a partner. Now, sexual reproduction. So consider the variety of trees, birds, fish, and plants in the world around you. So clearly many life forms are unique. When organisms reproduce sexually, their offspring display a variety of traits. Even members of the same species are not exact copies of each other. Sexual reproduction is responsible for the variety of life you see. In sexual reproduction, two parents combine their genetic materials to produce a new organism, which differs from both parents. Sexual reproduction involves an egg and a sperm cell joining to form a new cell in a process called fertilization. Okay, so sperm cells are from the father and contain half the father's chromosomes. Egg cells are from the mother and contain half the mother's chromosomes. When fertilization occurs, a full set of chromosomes is present in the new cell. Because offspring receive roughly half of their genetic information from each parent, they receive a combination of specific characteristics. A specific characteristic that an organism can pass to its offspring through its genes is called a trait. A gene is a sequence of DNA that determines a trait and is passed from parent to offspring. As a result, offspring may look very similar to the parents, or they may look very different, like the wild dogs. These differences are known as variations, and they will make you different from your siblings. Individual variations depend on which genes are passed down from each parent. So, like we have here, some people have this attached earlobe, some people have the free earlobe. Some people have this widow's peak, so have this little pointy thing, or some people have this, they don't have it. Some people have a this butt chin that is normally called, or they have just a regular chin. So it just depends on the traits that are being passed down. So remember, we have these dominant and recessive genes. So if, for example, these free earlobes are the dominant gene, then most people are going to have the free earlobes. Now, if you carry both recessive genes, then you might get this attached earlobe. So it just depends what genes are being passed down. Remember that even if the parent has these free earlobes, they could be passing down a recessive gene for the attached earlobe that they have from a previous generation, since it's still in their DNA. So asexual reproduction does have its pros and cons, just like sexual reproduction. So asexual does not need a mate. So fast reproduction with multiple offspring can occur. So since they don't need a mate, they can just reproduce as many times as they need to make that new generation. But the issue with that is that they have the same genetic makeup. So this is a large problem in our environment. For example, coral reefs. So coral do reproduce asexually. It's very so this coral cannot adapt to the climate change or the water temperatures rising because they do reproduce asexually. So since they're reproducing asexually, they're not getting this genetic variation at all. So if they're not able to adapt, then they're going to keep producing organisms that are not able to adapt, and thus they're going to eventually die off, which is what we see now in coral bleaching. So there are many instances where we get our inherited traits, of course, from our parents, from our grandparents, and things like that. So when sperm and egg cells come together, genetic information from the mother and the father are mixing. So inheritance is just a process by which an offspring receives genes from its parents. Genes are located on chromosomes and describe the factors that control a trait. Each trait is going to be described by a pair of genes, with one gene from the mother and one from the father. Sometimes the pair of genes are the same. At other times, there is two different genes in the pair. For example, imagine a mouse with white fur and a mouse with brown fur have offspring. The genes for fur color from each parent are different. Some of the offspring produced may be brown, some may be white, and others may be a combination of more than one color. Each offspring's fur color depends on how its inherited genes combine. So that's very important because it's just always determined by these traits. So for example, we have the genetic inheritance of eye color. So maybe both parents have brown eyes, but their recessive genes may say otherwise. So 75% of those children that they might have are going to have this brown color. Now we can have this 6% will have blue eyes, or 18% can have green eyes. So it just kind of depends on where we're getting this genetic inheritance from, because we might have recessive genes in our DNA that we might not be aware of, because that dominant trait always takes over, unless you mate with someone that also is a carrier of that recessive gene in order for that gene to become a phenotype. So we have these mice also that are right here. They have different shades. So we see these have this golden fur, we have this brown fur, and then we have these mixes in between. So we see that these two have this brown or golden color, that they have both. And then we have over here, we have this mouse that also does have this brown color. So it just determined by our genes. Same thing, this is one of our a little bit more complex to allele Punnett square, but I know you guys know how to do those already. So an allele is just a different form of the same gene. So one allele is going to be received from each parent, and the combination of alleles determines which traits of offsprings will have. So in the simplest cases, alleles are neither dominant or are either dominant or recessive. If an offspring inherits this dominant allele from either parent, that trait will always show up in their offspring. But if the offspring inherits recessive alleles from each parent, a recessive trait will show. This relationship allows parents with two dominant alleles to pass on recessive genes to their offspring. For example, two brown-eyed people may have a blue-eyed child. However, most genetic traits do not follow the simple pattern of dominant and recessive inheritance. So I'm actually going to pause here. Please make sure that you are taking very good notes of the material. I know that most of this stuff is review, but still make sure you take good notes, because our quizzes and things like that are going to be based on this material. Thank you.